Hey, everybody. We're nearing the end. For those of you who've been with us since Sunday night, we've got a lot going on. We're a pretty thin crowd. I think that sunshine, which is a rarity, might have something to do with it. But fortunately, we are recording this, so we can access it later. We're going to come over and get started. It's nice to see you. I hope you're having a good afternoon. I'm about to tell you right now. This is the book reading that doesn't involve reading, which is the kind of book reading we all like. Many of us listen to audiobooks, which are book talking. I'm personally a book talking fan, and this is a book talking session. So, some of you may know her as Lynn Peterson, President of Metro Regional Government. But today she's stopping by as an author on her promotional tour for her new book, Roadways for People, which was published last year by Island Press. In Roadways for People, Lynn Peterson draws from her personal experience and interviews with leaders in the field to showcase new possibilities within transportation engineering and planning. Her community solutions-based approach moves away from the narrow standards of traditional transportation design and focuses instead on a process that involves consistent feedback, learning loops, and meaningful and regular community engagement. This approach seeks to address the transportation needs of the most historically marginalized members of the community. Roadways for People is written to empower professionals and policymakers to create transportation solutions that serve people rather than cars. As traditional highway expansions are put on pause around the country, professionals and policymakers have an opportunity to move forward with a better approach. Joining Peterson for a discussion of the book is our colleague, collaborator, and some might even call him co-conspirator, from Better Eugene Springfield, Executive Director Rob Zako. After Lynn and Rob have had a chance to chat for about 30 minutes, we'll open up the floor to attendees workshop style to discuss how we move from the ideas discussed here today into action. Lynn, Rob, take it away, and thank you.
Thank you. Are we live here? So I'm Rob Zako. If people in the back want to move a little bit closer, don't be shy. We feel a little lonely up here. So a couple disclaimers. This is Lynn Peterson. This is her book, but this is not a book reading. And although schedule says that she'll be here from 3:30 to 4:30, she needs to leave at 4. So we're going to have a really quick conversation, and then Sarah's going to come up, as she said, and we're going to do something else. We're just going to have a chat here. And Lynn and I have been friends and colleagues for a long time.
It's a fireside chat.
Yeah, fireside chat. Okay, turn the lights down. Let's get really sort of, let's get down to the transportation. We've done this before. We did this a couple weeks ago. I'm just going to ask you a couple questions. This is a active transportation conference, of course, or public and active transportation. What's your vision for public and active transportation, Oregon and beyond, or am I asking the wrong question?
You know, the reason I wrote the book is that as professionals and even as advocates, we have our blinders on sometimes and we get too quickly to the solution that we think is the perfect. And I wanted to be able to start the conversation in a place where we could actually talk about the values that we have as a community, the outcomes that we want, and then have a conversation about the range of potential solutions. Because what we need to do as professionals is be open to solutions that we never thought of. Because usually we are thinking about a transportation asset as the only authority we have is to manage, operate, and maintain that asset. But in reality, we need to not build a project, a specific transportation project. We need to think about how we build a community with a transportation project. And that's a completely different set of starting principles. And so when people say the process is the solution, I agree.
So
I don't want to process it to death.
No. So let me see if I understand this. So you and I are transportation experts of various sorts. We've been doing this for many years.
30 plus.
Okay. We're up here because we're the experts. We have the answers. But you're saying that we're not the experts or the only experts.
No,
And
I
that we
mean,
need to talk to, so
yeah, I mean, if you ask me,
values,
with,
outcomes, how do we figure that out?
I mean, honestly, you show me an intersection, I'll say there needs to be a roundabout. Because I think roundabouts are the solution for everything. But that is not true. And if we start with the solution, and we haven't even asked what the problem statement is, we aren't actually solving problems for the community. We're solving a very narrow scoped set of solutions, and it's easy to succeed. So I started out as a highway design and construction engineer, and I had 4 performance metrics. This is what I was taught at Wisconsin DOT. I needed to move as many cars as quickly as possible, as safely as possible. That's on the design side. On the construction side, I needed to deliver a project on time and under budget. 4 performance metrics. Pretty easy to hit those performance metrics if those are your only 4. But things weren't going so well internally in my brain as I started to actually implement those on the ground, because the first project that I ended up working on as a design engineer was a 70-mile project that went from Madison, Wisconsin, north, the Wisconsin Dells, where mostly Milwaukee and Chicago played. And all of the farmers for 70 miles put up plywood signs in their front yard saying that the DOT was the devil, because they wanted to take a 2-lane roadway and make it into a 4-lane interstate. Yes, I hear the grunt, the disgusting noises from the crowd. How could you think of that? The new Secretary of Transportation came in. He was announced, and he immediately, in his confirmation speech, said we were going to do a new project, and it was based on safety. And then I was asked to do the safety analysis after we already announced. And the majority of the fatals, and if you've ever read a fatal report, I ask you to really consider understanding the depth of what you're going to feel if you've read fatal reports from the police. The majority of the deaths on the roadway were from DUI. And what I learned later in my career from Dr. John Tung, who was on the Oregon Traffic Safety Committee, a doctor who said, you cannot engineer your way out of bad behavior. I had never been told that. I had never heard that in my entire, at that point, 15-year career. I was taught that everybody who died was on my watch and I was responsible, and I had to engineer a solution out of that. So we're motivated by liability, and that has led us to the point where we only talk about what we have authority over and not what we have influence over.
So just today, Strong Towns has a review of your book, Charles Marone, and the review kind of says, Charles Marone is a reformed engineer, Lynn Peterson is a reformed engineer. So talk a little bit more, we've got a few minutes here, talk a little bit more of your path. You've done a few things since being at University of Wisconsin and working for Wisconsin DOT. So how did you, talk to us about your reform path and what other things you've done and tried to think outside that box.
Yeah, I really did question why I was in highway design and construction, because it was conflicting with my conservation ethic that I was raised on, the Aldo Leopold conservation ethic coming out of Wisconsin, the Sand County Almanac. It was the exact county that this highway went through in the first place. And what he says in that book, if you read it, is that you need to understand the system, right? The ecosystem. And then when you pull one thread, you need to understand the implications. And what he was talking about is, hey, if you have a lake that the Europeans back in 1700s have introduced a non-native species to, and you've completely destroyed the ecosystem within that lake, don't just throw a non-native back in, right? To get rid of that, you're creating a whole new ripple effect. You need to understand the entirety of the system. And when we're professionals, sometimes our blinders are so narrow to those performance metrics that we forget that we are creating a ripple and the impact. So What I did is I started to backtrack my way through the decision-making system, and so I got an urban regional planning degree and worked for Metro 25 years ago, where I'm now Metro Council President. I worked for the transit agency TriMet. I have worked as a consultant and ended up running Washington Department of Transportation and trying to put all of this into perspective while having a $10 billion budget with 3 mega projects.
You skipped a couple steps there. So you are trained as an engineer, but you're currently an elected official, and you've been elected 5 times, I believe.
Yes.
And that's where you've landed right now.
Yep.
So an engineer who indirectly directs other engineers and other people. So talk about that. What drove you to become an elected official, to run for elected office? You're really smart.
Yeah, why would anybody who's smart do that, right? Because I wanted to find the best place in the decision-making process where I could affect, again, upstream. This whole idea that when you start a project, you have to start from the very beginning and you have to understand your problem statement. And if you haven't done the community engagement to actually understand the context of the community, the trauma in that community, what has been going on, where those folks are, and understand their daily needs, you aren't setting up the problem statement for the planners, for the engineers, for everybody else to be able to find the solution set that works. Just as an example, I did 4-day training in Hawaii DOT, which was awesome. 125 folks from Hawaii DOT, and we took them out, and we did this with every DOT that we were doing training. We said, let's go to a pretend project if it was too political, or an actual project. And we would walk around the planners, the engineers, Caltrans, Hawaii DOT, Pennsylvania DOT, Iowa DOT, in the community. We'd have them look from everybody's perspective. As a senior trying to get to church on Sunday via transit, as a child trying to get home, as a family walking along the street. And every single time, I cannot tell you how they came back wide-eyed. Holy shit, what have we done? And in Hawaii DOT, the deputy secretary, who's now the secretary, native Hawaiian, he's like, he got up in front of everybody after that tour and said, I have made a huge mistake. When I came back into Hawaii DOT, I noticed that every single one of you, as project leads, as project engineers, designing your projects, you were only using Google Maps. They were only using Google Maps. And he told them to go drive their project. That was his idea, get out and look at your project. He's like, I made a huge mistake. You should be biking through your project, you should be walking through your project, you should be rolling through your project, you should be taking transit through your project. You need to understand your community. And I was blown away. This is the type of conversation that we need to have within our state DOTs, within our city, within our county DOTs, so that we are testing our assumptions. We thought this was the problem statement. Let's go test that. That is actually the scientific methodology, is it not? To test your assumptions. And if there's no way in the process or in the timeline, right, to test your assumptions, we are inherently creating bias and systematic racism. And this is the point I want to bring home, is if you don't test your assumptions, you are part of continuing this bias and this systematic racism.
So I want to share a brief story. In Eugene, Springfield, Best and ARP Oregon, who had a session earlier in this summit on walk audits in Eugene, Springfield Safe Routes to Schools, we did a walk audit around an elementary school in Eugene. And the mayor of Eugene came, and the co-chair of the neighborhood association came, and we walked just a few blocks. And during the time walking, there was somebody in a wheelchair, and they fell off their wheelchair because the ramp, the way it was designed, the access, we didn't script it or plan it, but it happened before our eyes. And we met a woman, this was school was getting out, and she drove 2 blocks from her home to pick up her daughter because she didn't feel like her daughter, the road that would be walking home had no shoulders, and she didn't want her daughter walking along there. And the mayor and the chair of the neighborhood association said, I didn't know any of these things. They're making advice to elected officials or making officials, and they don't know their own community on the ground at that level.
100%. The maintenance engineer for the state of California, Caltrans, was on our walking tour. And this was in a lower income, mostly Latino neighborhood in Los Angeles. And we did the neighborhood tour, and he came back, and I had already seen this. I had, had already walked it. I was like, oh, I hope somebody notices this. At the end of every curb ramp, at the on and off ramps onto the highway that went through the area, there was a giant asphalt bump at the bottom because the asphalt had morphed as people come around the corner. It had morphed into a speed bump at the bottom on every single one. And he came back and he had noticed it, and he said, you know what? I think we've made a huge mistake. We are only doing asphalt overlays on the main line as a cost saving. We aren't doing the on and off ramps because we can set the machine to one standard size and get efficiency out of just doing the main line. If we go down on the on and off ramps, we have to switch machine sizes. So we haven't been doing, he's like, we've made a mistake. It's just, get out and look at the community, right? It's mind-boggling to think that we have to actually ask, but we do. And I think as advocates, as planners and engineers, like to be the one in the room to just ask the questions. Who's going to be involved in the decision-making? How are they going to be involved? How do we empower them? How do we actually create this problem statement with everyone? And how do we go out and learn as much as we can? How can we be curious and empathetic? Because when you're a planner, and I just had this question asked to me by students at University of Arizona, Tucson, that I did a workshop with. The question was, how do I be neutral as a planner? I'm like, you don't. You're supposed to be there to advocate for an inclusive process. That is your job. And then your job is to also make sure that the decision makers have all the information. It's not neutrality. It's the protector of an inclusive process and a process that leads to hard conversations about multiple vague and conflicting goals, as Cy Adler, retired professor of PSU, would say. Multiple vague and conflicting goals. That is our job. It is not to take the tension out of the room. It is to help mitigate through that and find ways to solve for multiple vague and conflicting goals.
So we've got about 10 more minutes before you have to turn into pumpkin.
And talk about food composting. That's my next
You're
job.
anticipating my final question, so I'm going to ask you to give advice to three classes of people: government staff, planners, engineers, folks like that, one; two, elected officials; and finally, advocates. So you started talking about what you think the job of a planner should be. What additional advice do you have for planners and engineers and folks like that in the room who might be listening via Zoom?
Planners and engineers are trained to help do problem solving. But we think that we come in with the answers and that it's a very narrowly defined toolkit, right? A very narrowly set of tools. And I think what we need to do is be open to the tension. And in Portland polite, in Oregon polite, we are not exactly allowing for this tension to come to the surface and then find ways to mitigate it. So I would say the very thing that has made me effective in my long journey is putting the elephant in the middle of the room, but not pointing fingers. This is not about pointing fingers. This is about being able to create an inclusive process and make sure that the process leads to empowerment of the community as well as many solutions being on the table as possible. For advocates,
Hang on, I'll get you there. So you're talking about not pointing fingers. To be a good interviewer, I should force you to be specific and give examples. So without pointing fingers, what advice do you have for other politicians, other elected officials, maybe even some of your colleagues here in Oregon or in the Portland metro region without naming names? How can they be part of more effective transportation of finding solutions in a collaborative way?
What I have found is that I have to always, as an elected official, not come to the table with a solution. If I come to the table with a solution, and we all know now that I love roundabouts, that is the first thing that comes into my head. But I never really say it. I mean, well, okay, 8.5 out of 10 times I don't say it. That's how much it comes into my head. That we could deal with that with a roundabout. If you come to the table with a solution, you have already killed the process as an elected official. You have to be about the process itself. And again, asking who was at the table, how are they empowered? What did we learn from them? Did we actually go and what does it mean to empower, right? Did we actually go and use plain language? Did we go and use community-based organizations to get the input? The transportation ballot measure that we put on the ballot here in the Portland region was not just a 2-year development with a 35-member task force. It was actually 6 years of advanced work to put grant making into community-based organizations to get their capacity built up so that they could actually then propose on a request for proposals for community engagement to actually get the input for the transportation ballot measure so that they had the capacity to understand and be able to go out into the community with the technical information in their hip pocket, but also know how to create safe spaces for their community to give the best input that they could give with the most support that they could give in plain language. And we got so much information out of that about what their actual needs were, not what the traffic engineer thought their needs were. So we started from a different place.
I gave you a little speed bump there. You wanted to go and talk about advocates. You and I met each other a few years ago. You were at 1,000 Friends of Oregon as a transportation advocate. A few years after that, I held that position. There are a few advocates here in the room, or people who are advocates at heart. Now, what advice do you have for those of us who are outside of government who are trying to make our community, our state, our nation better?
First, I would say, make sure that whatever process you're in, that you're forcing that conversation backwards into the values and outcomes that the community wants. If they have already advanced to the point where they're giving you a problem statement, force them to test that. Force a conversation about how do you test those assumptions. The second is, I think we all need to understand the pressures that somebody in the bureaucracy is feeling based on their understanding of what their job is. We, as advocates, need to give them the space and the cover to be able to move differently. And that, to me, is the most important, is constantly just driving home in every meeting and then potentially going up to the elected official and letting them know. Because as somebody who has managed a 6,800 person agency with a $10 billion budget, I can tell you, I don't know what everybody's job is, right? And as an elected official, again, 1,000 people, I don't know exactly what everybody's job is, but if I know that something is headed in the wrong direction or the right questions aren't being asked, I can stop something and say, stop, I need to ask you to go backward 2 steps to be able to go forward 3 steps. Because we're not going to get where we need to go if we don't just take the time. Staff tend to think that once you've set a deadline, because of a funding cycle or whatever, that they are hard, fast on meeting that expectation of elected officials or their boss. But if there's an issue in the community and you don't raise it, you don't ever give the elected official or your boss the opportunity to say, oh, common sense says we should slow down. And so I would say sometimes you have to go above, even though you're trying to work with an individual, you have to go above them to give them the opportunity for their boss or their elected official say, oh, I see what the issue is. We need to slow down.
So I want to ask you about an example. I won't name the example because there are dozens, hundreds of them. It could be so many projects I've worked on. But what I've seen as an advocate is a government agency defines a problem itself, and it's Mount Apple Pie. We want safety. We want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We want economic development. We want mobility. We want it all. And the answer is to expand a highway. Okay. And it's hard to sort of challenge the problem statement because it's saying all the values. We want everything, but the only technical way to achieve all those values is the most expensive, the most impactful, the road winding sort of thing. I don't know if you've ever experienced that in your work, but I've come across it a couple times. So I'm asking seriously as an advocate. I mean, there's some projects down in the part of the world that I work, and that's what the government agency is saying, and we've tried to challenge that, and it's really hard to gain traction from the outside because they're the experts, and they're trying to do everything, right? So how can we object to that? They're trying to make everybody happy.
So that just makes me think of two specific things. One, the professional, again, believes that they only have authority over the transportation asset that they own, operate, and maintain. So they believe that their only way out of the problem is to fix their transportation asset. So if you're a highway design and construction engineer, you don't have any control authority over the transit agency. So what gives you the permission to go say, I got to go work with the transit agency, which is.
Or whoever controls housing is that a
That's
highway
right.
connects a satellite community to
That's right.
a job center, and just magically more traffic appears. There's
So-
no control over that, so you have to build a bigger highway.
Right. So again, it comes down to the problem statement. If your problem statement was created 20 years ago, which most of them are, and they're scoped and they're put in a metropolitan transportation improvement program or a state transportation improvement program, it is one sentence. To solve congestion at intersection X by installing 2 left turn lanes for a cost of $5 million. And it's 20 years ago. And now we're just coming around to the project and nobody tests that statement. They go in, they say to the community, look at this wonderful 2 left turn lanes we're going to give you. And the community's like, but it's hard to cross the street right now. And there's no way I'm going to get across that. And they're pissed.
I would love to keep talking with you. I enjoy being together, but you've got to go talk about food waste. Fine.
Second part of all that.
Closing
Yeah.
statements here.
No. Your question on the default of highway expansion. The question is for whom? Right? Because again, if your only measure is to move as many cars as fast as possible, as safely as possible, we have to change those metrics. And the question is, who are the users of the transportation system, and how do we get those metrics up front so any possible solutions are measured against that? And we did that at WashDOT. We changed the congestion report to a corridor capacity report. So instead of talking about where the hot spots in congestion were, we talked about where we can grow by bike, by bus, by light rail, where the capacity was and how we needed to move people onto those other modes. It was a completely different way of reporting out.
So if I understand what you're saying, you're talking about corridors or maybe roadways for people, not for motor vehicles.
Yeah, maybe roadways for people. Mhm.
And you ever thought about writing a book about that? Just, sorry, too cutesy. You unfortunately need to leave right now. There are some books there. I don't know if you can stay for just a couple minutes if people want to get that, but we're in the middle of the session here. Sarah, this is your party. What do you want to do next?
Sarah, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for all of you being here. And if there's ever a moment where I can come down and work with your community and move things to this kind of conversation, I'd be happy to do it. Thank you.
So if you buy a book, if they buy a book, you'll sign it?
Yes.
Yeah, so buy your books. We'll take a 5-minute break because she's got to go. If you want to sign book, do it now. And we'll gather back in 5 minutes once President.
Do you have a present? Are you John? Yeah. Yeah, there's a book with your name on it, or I don't know if it's signed yet, but you're first one to get signed.
Yay, John.
And then we'll get back together in just a minute or two, and Rob and I will debrief that conversation with you. Proxies, we'll try to channel Lynn to the best that we're able. I tried to dress for the role, Lynn, but I don't know if I pulled it off. Oh, and round of applause. Thank you very much.